The only thing left for us to do is to find out that third objection. There's no historical evidence. Maybe it's just a novel. How do you know it's really history? And for that, we need to go to the archaeological evidence. If you go to the 3rd chapter of Luke's Gospel, there you find Luke identifying an emperor by the name of Tiberius Caesar. He also identifies in his 3rd chapter a guy who, by the name of Pontius Pilate. And you ask, would any self-respecting parent name their son Pontius Pilate? That's a fictitious guy for sure. And he says the event he's going to describe was in the high priesthood of a guy by the name of Caiaphas, a Jewish high priest. Now, how do we know he's talking about real people? Well, archaeologists come in and say, well, because we find those same names in archaeological discoveries. For example, here in the Biblical Archaeology Review, they did an excavation of the city of Caesarea Maritima, right on the Mediterranean coast of Judea. And there they found a building stone. And on that building stone was carved the names Pontius Pilate and the name Tiberius, the Caesar, the emperor of the Roman Empire. They were contemporaries. That's exactly what Luke said. When Tiberius was the emperor, Pontius Pilate was the governor. Archaeology confirms that Luke got that right. He's talking about real people, not fictitious people. Or something like a bone box. Bone boxes were used for secondary burial in the time of Jesus. Someone would die, the dead body would be covered with spices that have the capability of dehydrating, removing the water. And so they cover the body and then wrap the whole body in cloth. Place that body into a cave. They didn't really consider them cemeteries. They simply had a limestone cave on their property, and that became their cemetery. They would put the person in there, wait a year, and all of the moisture would have been evaporated and absorbed out of the body, and all you have a year later when you remove the cloth is the skeleton and maybe a little parchment-like covering over the bones. That's about all that's left. So now they take the bones apart. Now you have a pile of bones. What are you going to do with them? You're going to put them in that box called an ossuary or bone box. And then you put the name of the individual on the end of the box. You can see the little carving there. That's the name of the individual who was supposed to be in that box. That was only used about 100 years. About 30 years before Jesus, and all the way up until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Then they quit doing this. So when you find a bone box, you know it's somebody in it that was around the time of Jesus. How'd they get this box? They were doing road construction in Jerusalem, just south of the Temple Mount in the city of David. All of a sudden, heavy equipment sunk into the ground like something collapsed. And sure enough, it did. When they got it out, they realized that equipment had broken through the roof of a limestone cave. They had no idea it was there. And when they got them excavated out, they found this box. And they found 4 boxes in total. It turned out to be the burial cave of the high priest's family who presided over the trial of Jesus, Joseph, Caiaphas. There was a son, Simon. There were 2 daughters that were also found boxes with their names on them. Evidently, remember I said Luke identified the high priest, Caiaphas? He just used the family name. But we know from this bone box and from a Jewish historian late in the 1st century that the high priest's name was Joseph Caiaphas. Exactly fits the box. And they had just uncovered that. So once again, archaeology confirmed the historicity of what Luke had to say. So when we read in Matthew's account, and those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, we know that we're talking not about fiction, not about legendary figures. We're talking about real people of history. Another bone box was found. It's much more controversial than the one I just showed you. It has on the side of it, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Well, if you find one like that, you know you've got a really significant and important find. So it became controversial. It was claimed by some that the brother of Jesus was added later. And so they had a 7-year court trial in Israel over this box. And finally, the scientific investigation of the engraving demonstrated that the engraving was all put on at the same time. There were no differences in time. And it was all early when it was first quarried. And as a result, they are now identifying it as, in fact, it's a legitimate box. When it says in the Gospels, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brothers, there it is, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. There were other brothers, but this is the box of James, the brother of Jesus. And it's interesting that this box, the limestone, dates to approximately 62 AD. James, we know from other history, the brother of Jesus, died in 63. So the dates are exact. It fits precisely that this is likely the bone box of the brother of Jesus, the half-brother, if you would rather identify it that way. I must, in the interest of time, simply give you illustrations and examples because there are so many. The pool of Siloam is mentioned in John chapter 9:7. It is now identified in Jerusalem. Quirinius, one of the rulers identified in Luke 2:2, has also been identified by archaeologists. Erastus, mentioned in Romans 16:23. Lysanias in Luke 3:1. The pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, John 5:2. Sergius Paulus in Acts chapter 13:7. All of these they've found artifacts, they've found plaques, they found whatever it was necessary to confirm that all of these references to people are references to historical people, not to legends, not to fiction in any way. Even, and this is an extra, even in the Old Testament, though that's not of prime concern to me because I'm mostly wanting to make sure that we get to the place where we have the foundation and evidence for the person of Jesus. And that's coming out of the New Testament. But if you go to the Old Testament, this recently was published in Biblical Archaeology Review. Archaeology confirms 50 real people in the Bible. Now that is more than that now because recently they've published some more. 1000 BC, before Christ. 400 BC, which is the end of the Old Testament time period. During that 600-year period, they have now found 50 archaeological discoveries that confirm all of those characters from the Old Testament are now confirmed to be historically true by archaeologists. Here's an interesting one, and with that I will have to kind of cease my case on this, and that is the crucifixion of Jesus. The critics, the experts of Roman history, maintained that the Romans did not crucify people with nails prior to the end of the 2nd century. But Jesus was crucified by about 30 in the 1st century. Therefore, he couldn't possibly have been crucified with nails like the gospel writers tell us he was. They're wrong. They must not have been eyewitnesses or they'd have known better. Until 1968, when a bone box was found in Jerusalem with a crucifixion victim in it. How did they know? The nail was still through the ankles and the feet. When was this individual crucified? Based on artifacts that were found with it, radiocarbon dating, and a variety of other ways of checking that, it was published in Biblical Archaeology Review that this individual was crucified between 25 and 42 AD, right in the time period in which Jesus is claimed to have been crucified, about 30. Did the Romans use nails at the time of Jesus for crucifixion? Archaeology says yes. The experts were wrong about the practice of Rome. When they came to the place called the skull, there they crucified him, and the Gospels say, and attached him with nails. Testimony of a scholar, Dr. Paul Meyer, Michigan University, was my reader for the Black Book. that you all have there, Surprised by Faith. Internationally recognized expert in the field of archaeology and manuscripts read the text and made sure that we were on track with it. So we've gotten to know him. But here's a statement that he made, not about my book, but about archaeology in general. Ever since scientific archaeology started a century and a half ago, the consistent pattern has been this. Hard evidence from the ground has borne out the biblical record again and again and again. C.S. Lewis, as you know, was an atheist at Magdalen College, Oxford. He was a professor of medieval literature, one trained to know whether literature is good, bad, historical, or otherwise. And one of his friends challenged him by saying to him, have you ever truly, literary-wise, investigated the records of Jesus, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even the rest of the New Testament? And he had to admit that he had simply rejected them out of hand, not believing that they had any merit whatsoever. But he took up the challenge. He gave it his best literary test. And after a period of time, C.S. Lewis, evaluating the literature of the New Testament, came to conclude that they was not only a record of eyewitness integrity, but they were a record of history. And he came face to face with the historical person of Jesus, whom he ultimately professed to be his Savior and his Lord. As a result, C.S. Lewis, in the 20th century, became the foremost apologist. That doesn't mean he's saying he's sorry. It means he's the champion in defense of the claims of the Christian faith, writing books like Mere Christianity, The Chronicles of Narnia, and a host of others. I have them all on my shelf. It comes probably a shelf that, all in the 20th century. Probably no one has done more about bringing forth the evidence in support of the Christian faith than C.S. Lewis in the 20th century. So what do we say to the individual on Nicollet Mall? There's no historical evidence for the stories of Jesus. True or false? It's just false. Just because they don't know about the evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So the evidence of manuscripts and archaeology are convincing that the New Testament records are eyewitness accounts transmitted with integrity and historically reliable. So archaeological discoveries have confirmed that the New Testament writings are historically reliable. I realize that that list is brief, and that for someone who really wants to challenge and question, you may want to dig deeper. In the chapter 2, in the book that you were given with this seminar, there are more examples, if you'd like to check that out. In addition, I want you to notice that the book that you have is not Don Byerly's opinion. There are about 80 footnotes of reference to published literature in chapter 2 alone, documenting every number, every bit of data that I have been giving to you